Betrayal didn't arrive loudly in my life. It arrived as a lie repeated so often by my own family that the truth no longer recognized my name. I stood there while it happened, calm on the outside, listening to my own blood describe me as the problem, the manipulator, the traitor, and I realized something in that moment that changed everything. I had helped the wrong person in the wrong way, and now I was being punished for doing the right thing quietly. I supported my sister when her marriage collapsed, not because I wanted to take sides, but because she showed up at my door broken, shaking, and empty, and I believed family was still supposed to mean something then. I didn't ask questions that night. I didn't demand explanations. I didn't call her ex-husband names or take pleasure in his fall. I gave her a room. I gave her time. I gave her silence. I thought that was enough. I thought that was safe. It wasn't. What I didn't know then was that support, when offered without control, becomes a threat to people who survive on influence. I didn't understand that by giving her space to breathe, I had taken away something others depended on, power over her story. I learned that lesson too late, after the story had already been rewritten with me as the villain. At first, the changes were small. A different tone at family dinners. Conversations that stopped when I entered the room. Text messages that went unanswered for days. I noticed it, but I didn't challenge it. I told myself people were stressed. Divorce does that to families. It creates sides even when no one chooses them out loud. I stayed quiet because I believed silence was respectful. Silence, I would later learn, is only powerful when you control the narrative. When you don't, it becomes permission. She began telling her version slowly, carefully, not with rage but with sadness. That was the smart part. She never accused me directly at first. She simply shared concerns, worries, doubts. She framed everything as confusion. I don't think he understands how hard this is for me. Sometimes I feel judged. I wish he would support me the way others do. No names. No confrontations. Just enough to plant an idea and let it grow on its own. People listen harder to pain than to truth. I continued helping in practical ways. I covered expenses without mentioning it. I adjusted my schedule so she wouldn't feel alone. I defended her when others questioned her choices. Every time I did, the distance grew wider. The more stable I became, the more uncomfortable it made everyone else. Stability exposes manipulation. Calm exposes exaggeration. And I was too calm. I remember the first time I realized I had lost control of how I was being seen. It was a casual conversation, nothing dramatic. Someone laughed and said, "You've always liked being in charge." The sentence floated there, light and careless, but it wasn't mine. It had been borrowed, repeated, tested before being released in my presence to see how I would react. I smiled. I said nothing. That silence was noted too. What no one tells you is that when a family decides who you are, your behavior no longer matters. Every action becomes evidence. If you speak, you're defensive. If you stay quiet, you're guilty. If you help, you're controlling. If you step back, you're abandoning. There is no winning once the verdict is emotionally agreed upon. The divorce wasn't my conflict. I wasn't in that marriage. I didn't cause the betrayal that ended it. But somehow, by refusing to demonize one side and refusing to exploit the pain, I became suspicious. Neutrality made me dangerous. Balance made me untrustworthy. Soon, the invitations stopped coming. Decisions were made without me. Plans changed last minute. When I asked why, I was told everyone was just trying to keep things peaceful. That word, peaceful, was used like a weapon. It didn't mean calm. It meant compliant. It meant I was expected to accept my new role quietly and gratefully. I watched my sister change too. She grew more confident as my position weakened. Her sadness sharpened into certainty. She spoke with authority now, not confusion. Her pain had found an audience, and the audience had rewarded it. Sympathy became validation. Validation became power. And I let it happen longer than I should have, because I believed truth didn't need defending. The real betrayal wasn't that she spoke against me. People say things when they're hurting. The real betrayal was that the family listened without asking me a single question. Not one. They didn't come to me privately. They didn't seek clarity. They didn't challenge contradictions. They chose comfort over complexity. Her story was easier to hold than the idea that support could exist without control. I became the lesson they warned each other about. The example. The cautionary tale. I heard it in the way my name was used when I wasn't there. We don't want things to get complicated. Let's not involve him. You know how he is. Each sentence shaved away another piece of who I actually was. I kept thinking it would correct itself. That time would expose exaggeration. That consistency would rebuild trust. I underestimated how much people prefer emotional alignment over factual accuracy. Once they bonded over a shared belief about me, questioning it would have meant questioning themselves. There's a particular kind of loneliness that comes from being surrounded by people who think they know you better than you know yourself. You stop trying to explain because explanations become performances. You start listening more than speaking. You begin to see patterns. You realize who benefits from your silence and who is threatened by your clarity. That's when my patience stopped being passive. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't announce boundaries. I didn't demand respect. I simply began paying attention. I listened to how stories were told. I noted what details were repeated and which ones were skipped. I watched how sympathy was distributed and how responsibility was redirected. I learned who spoke first and who followed. I learned who needed me to react and who feared I wouldn't. Quiet revenge doesn't begin with action. It begins with understanding. By the time I realized my family had already chosen their version of events, I also realized something else. They had underestimated me completely. They thought my silence meant weakness. They thought my distance meant defeat. They believed I would eventually explode or apologize or disappear. I did none of those things. Instead, I stayed exactly where I was, calm, observant, and no longer emotionally invested in being believed. That was the moment the balance shifted, even though no one noticed it yet. Because when you stop needing approval, you start seeing leverage. They thought the story was over. It wasn't even started yet. Danger entered quietly when I realized my absence was being used more than my presence ever had. I noticed it the first time a decision was made in my name without my consent. Someone said I had agreed it was better this way. They said it casually, as if repeating something obvious. I didn't correct it. I didn't interrupt. I watched who nodded. I watched who looked relieved. That told me more than any argument ever could. From that moment on, I understood that the story no longer needed me in it to function. My role had been simplified into a shape that fit everyone else's comfort. I was the controlling one, the difficult one, the one whose support came with conditions. None of that matched my actions, but it matched their needs. And needs are louder than facts. I kept my routine unchanged. Same tone. Same restraint. Same distance that was now interpreted as strategy instead of respect. The irony didn't escape me. Everything I had done to keep peace was now being cited as evidence that I never wanted it. My sister rarely spoke to me directly anymore. When she did, her words were careful, rehearsed, framed for later repetition. She asked questions that weren't really questions. She made statements disguised as concern. I answered briefly, clearly. I stopped explaining myself. Explanation feeds distortion. Clarity starves it. What unsettled her wasn't my refusal to argue. It was my refusal to collapse. People who rely on emotional leverage expect visible reactions. Tears. Anger. Apologies. I offered none of those. I stayed level. That forced her to escalate elsewhere. I began hearing about conversations I hadn't been part of. Long talks. Emotional nights. Shared conclusions. I was always mentioned, never present. That's where reputations are rewritten most efficiently. In rooms you're not invited into, by people who benefit from your absence. There was a moment, brief but sharp, when someone finally confronted me. Not aggressively. Gently. They said, "You know, some people feel like you made this about yourself." The sentence was delivered like a gift. An opportunity for confession. A chance to restore balance by accepting blame. I looked at them and realized this wasn't a question. It was a test. They weren't seeking understanding. They were seeking compliance. They wanted me to validate the story so everyone could stop feeling uneasy about believing it. I said only one thing. I supported her when she asked. Nothing more. That answer unsettled the room. It didn't deny emotion. It didn't assign guilt. It didn't defend my character. It simply stated a fact without decoration. Facts are uncomfortable when people have already invested in a narrative that requires interpretation. After that, the pressure changed shape. It became indirect, passive, concerned. I was advised to give space, to reflect, to let others lead. Advice is often control dressed as care. I accepted it outwardly while quietly reclaiming my position inwardly. I stepped back completely, not out of shame, but out of clarity. I stopped offering help. I stopped attending gatherings where my presence was tolerated rather than welcomed. I stopped correcting false assumptions. I let the story continue without interference. And something interesting happened. Without my steady support, small cracks began to show. Financial stress surfaced. Emotional inconsistencies appeared. Details stopped aligning. The same people who once praised her strength began asking careful questions. Not because they doubted her yet, but because the weight of reality had shifted. I didn't rush this part. Truth reveals itself slowly when it isn't chased. I stayed quiet while others filled the silence with speculation. I watched sympathy turn into expectation. Expectation into disappointment. The very traits that had been admired, fragility, dependence, emotional authority, started to feel heavy to those carrying them. She noticed the shift before anyone else did. Her messages changed tone again. Less confident. More probing. She wanted reassurance without admitting she needed it. She wanted access without acknowledging what she had taken. I remained polite. Neutral. Distant. Distance is powerful when it's consistent. The family didn't come back to me all at once. That would have required admitting a collective mistake. Instead, they circled quietly. Individual messages. Small gestures. Invitations framed as coincidences. Each one was a test to see if I would return to my old role without conditions. I didn't. I accepted nothing that required me to pretend the past hadn't happened. I didn't confront anyone about betrayal. I didn't demand apologies. I simply held my ground without hostility. That confused them more than anger ever could have. People expect revenge to be loud. They prepare for confrontation. They defend against accusations. What they're not prepared for is composure. They don't know how to respond when the person they diminished doesn't seek restoration through emotion. By the time they realized I wasn't coming back the same way, the balance had already changed. I was no longer the background support holding everything together. I had become the quiet absence that exposed what I once absorbed. And still, I said nothing. Because the most effective moment in any quiet revenge is the one where you do less, and let others finally feel the weight you carried alone. Shock settled in when I understood that my calm was no longer ignored. It was being feared. The tone around me changed again, but this time it carried hesitation. Conversations paused when I entered, not because they were hiding something, but because they were unsure how I would interpret what they said. That uncertainty was new. It hadn't existed when they believed they had defined me completely. Now, they weren't sure who I was anymore, and that unsettled them. I began noticing subtle reversals. Stories once told with confidence were now retold with qualifiers. I might be remembering this wrong. Maybe I misunderstood. These weren't apologies. They were emotional insurance policies. People preparing to step back without admitting they had stepped forward too far. My sister felt it most intensely. The audience that once listened without question had grown quiet. Not distant. Quiet. Silence from supporters is more dangerous than opposition. It forces self-examination, and self-examination is uncomfortable when your power comes from certainty. She tried once more to bring me into a direct exchange. Not to reconcile, but to recalibrate. She wanted me to react, to engage, to say something that could be shaped later. I recognized it immediately. I declined politely. Not coldly. Just enough to deny access. That refusal did more than any argument could have. When you stop playing the role assigned to you, the script collapses. People start improvising. Improvisation reveals motive. I watched as concern turned into defensiveness, as empathy turned into irritation. The emotional energy that had once flowed toward her story began dispersing. I didn't celebrate it. I didn't feel victorious. What I felt was clarity. The kind that comes when you realize you were never meant to fight, only to step aside and let imbalance expose itself. There was one evening that confirmed everything for me. A small gathering. Nothing formal. I attended without expectations. I spoke little. I listened. And for the first time, someone referenced a moment I had lived through accurately. No distortion. No interpretation. Just the truth, spoken casually, without weight. No one corrected it. That was the turning signal. Not because it redeemed me publicly, but because it showed the narrative no longer needed defending. It was unraveling on its own. Later, someone pulled me aside. They didn't apologize. They didn't explain. They simply said, "This all got more complicated than it needed to be." That sentence held more accountability than any excuse could have. Complexity is what people blame when they don't want to admit bias. I nodded. I didn't expand on it. I didn't seek validation. By then, I understood that being right was no longer the goal. Being steady was. The family dynamic never fully returned to what it had been before. And I didn't want it to. The illusion had been broken. Roles had shifted. People had seen how easily perception could be shaped when emotion outweighed balance. My sister eventually found her footing elsewhere. Not through confrontation. Not through admission. Through distance. The kind that allows dignity to remain intact even when truth remains unspoken. We coexist now with clear boundaries and fewer assumptions. That's the quiet consequence of manipulation. It limits future access. As for me, I was never formally restored. No announcement was made. No correction issued. But I didn't need one. The weight lifted gradually. Conversations normalized. Invitations returned without explanation. My presence stopped feeling conditional. Quiet revenge doesn't end with triumph. It ends with equilibrium. I learned that supporting someone doesn't guarantee loyalty. That silence can be misused by others before it can be used by you. And that the most effective response to betrayal is not exposure, but restraint paired with consistency. People eventually see patterns when you stop interrupting them with emotion. Sometimes silence isn't surrender. Sometimes it's the moment you let the truth speak in a voice louder than yours ever could. Betrayal doesn't end when the damage is done. It lingers when people pretend nothing happened and expect you to return unchanged. By the time the tension settled, everyone acted as if the past had folded itself away neatly. No one referenced the distance. No one acknowledged the silence. The expectation was simple and unspoken. Move forward without reopening discomfort. That's how families preserve appearances. They smooth over fractures instead of examining what caused them. Part of the setup people never notice is how roles quietly reset after conflict. I was no longer the steady presence by default. I had become optional. Conditional. That shift wasn't announced, but it was enforced through tone, timing, and access. I watched it happen without resisting it, because resistance would have implied I wanted the old role back. I didn't. What I wanted was clarity. I began redefining my place without asking permission. I chose when to show up. I chose when to speak. I chose when to disengage. That autonomy unsettled people who were used to me being predictably available. Predictability makes others comfortable. Independence makes them cautious. The family dynamic depended heavily on emotional alignment. Whoever expressed the most visible vulnerability guided the mood. That had been my sister's strength during her divorce. Pain had given her authority. Authority had reshaped relationships. And once those patterns form, they don't dissolve easily, even when the pain softens. I observed how conversations flowed. Who was deferred to? Who was protected from discomfort? Who was expected to absorb tension quietly? That last role had once been mine. It wasn't anymore. My withdrawal wasn't dramatic. It was methodical. I stopped filling gaps. When someone was late, I didn't compensate. When plans were vague, I didn't organize them. When emotions ran high, I didn't stabilize the room. I allowed things to wobble. And they did. People are often surprised by how much structure is held together by the person who never complains. When that person steps back, the absence is felt before it's understood. Friction appears. Small disagreements linger longer. Responsibilities get passed around awkwardly. No one steps in automatically. That's when the questions begin. Quiet ones. Private ones. Not about blame, but about logistics. Are you coming? Can you help with this? What do you think we should do? Each question acknowledged something without naming it. My value had been assumed, not appreciated. I answered selectively. Not to punish, but to recalibrate. I gave input without ownership. Assistance without obligation. Presence without performance. That balance is difficult for people used to emotional dependency. It forces them to stand on their own interpretations instead of leaning on yours. My sister struggled with this shift. Without constant reinforcement, her narrative lost momentum. It didn't collapse, it thinned. She was still believed, but less defended. Still heard, but less centered. That difference mattered. I noticed she began mirroring my restraint. Less emotional display. More guarded responses. Power dynamics often mimic strength, not truth. She adapted because she sensed the environment changing. That adaptation confirmed what I had already learned. Much of what had happened wasn't personal. It was structural. The setup wasn't about hatred or malice. It was about comfort. About who made life easier emotionally. For a long time, that had been me. Then it was her. Now, no one held that position securely, and the imbalance made everyone uneasy. I didn't rush to resolve it. Quiet revenge requires patience not because you want others to suffer, but because you want patterns to reveal themselves fully. Intervening too early only resets the cycle. I allowed the discomfort to breathe. I allowed people to notice it. Gradually, responsibility redistributed itself. Conversations became more honest, if less warm. Expectations lowered. Boundaries formed naturally. Not because anyone announced them, but because no one could afford confusion anymore. That's when I understood the real setup of what had happened. I hadn't been pushed out because I was wrong. I had been pushed out because I was stable. And stability threatened systems built on emotional imbalance. Injustice doesn't always look like attack. Sometimes it looks like being slowly edited out while everyone insists nothing has changed. As time passed, I noticed how decisions were framed without me, then gently delivered afterward as updates rather than invitations. It was subtle, almost polite. The kind of exclusion that carries plausible deniability. If I reacted, I would seem sensitive. If I didn't, the pattern would continue. So I treated it the way I treated everything else, with observation, not reaction. I paid attention to who benefited from my absence and who struggled because of it. That distinction matters. Some people grow louder when structure disappears. Others grow quiet. I watched both closely. Loudness often signals insecurity. Quiet usually signals recalibration. I also became more aware of how often my sister referenced emotional fatigue. Not as vulnerability, but as positioning. Fatigue grants exemption. It excuses inconsistency. It shifts accountability. People accepted it without question, because questioning fatigue feels cruel. I understood the tactic now, not intellectually, but practically. I didn't challenge it. I adjusted around it. When requests came, I responded later. Not to delay, but to remove urgency. Urgency is a lever. It forces compliance before reflection. By slowing my responses, I slowed the momentum of expectation. People had to plan without assuming my availability. Some didn't like that. There were moments of passive frustration. Short remarks, half-jokes, comments about how things were different now. They were right. They just didn't understand why. Difference feels threatening when you benefited from the old balance. I became careful with language. Precise. I avoided emotional framing. I spoke in terms of capacity and choice. I can't commit to that. I won't be available. That doesn't work for me. No explanations. Explanations invite negotiation. Statements establish reality. That shift changed how people approached me. They became more intentional, less casual. They weighed their words. They considered outcomes. I was no longer the emotional buffer absorbing excess tension. I was a boundary. My sister noticed this too. She tested it once, indirectly. She shared a concern, vague but loaded, designed to pull me back into the stabilizing role. I acknowledged it without engaging. I didn't soothe. I didn't fix. I didn't validate the implication. The silence afterward was heavy. Power struggles often reveal themselves in moments where one person expects emotional labor and doesn't receive it. She wasn't angry. She was unsettled. That told me everything. Anger would have meant I still mattered in the old way. Unsettled meant the leverage was gone. The family dynamic adjusted again. People began addressing issues more directly with each other instead of routing them through me. That created friction. Directness always does at first. But friction is honest. It doesn't pretend to be peace. I was no longer the quiet mediator smoothing rough edges. I had become something else, consistent but not accommodating, present but not pliable. That identity confused those who had relied on me being both supportive and silent. I also noticed a shift in how my absence was described. It was no longer framed as distance. It was framed as choice. He's doing his own thing. That language matters. Choice implies agency. Agency changes how people speak about you when you're not there. There were no dramatic confrontations. No emotional breakthroughs. Just a slow rebalancing of expectations. People learned what I would and wouldn't absorb. They learned that support for me came without surrender. That realization carried weight. Injustice loses its grip when you stop participating in the system that sustains it. You don't have to expose it. You don't have to punish it. You simply remove the reinforcement that makes it effective. By the end of that phase, I was no longer reacting to what had been done to me. I was operating from a place that didn't require correction or validation. I had moved from defense to definition. And once you define yourself clearly, others are forced to respond to who you are, not who they need you to be. Control doesn't disappear when it's challenged. It disguises itself and waits to see if you'll notice. By this point, the dynamic had settled into something quieter but sharper. There was less drama, fewer emotional displays, but more calculation. I could feel it in the way conversations angled toward reassurance without asking for it directly. People wanted confirmation that the ground had stopped shifting. I didn't give it. I had learned that comfort, when offered too freely, teaches others how much they can take. I watched how responsibility was redistributed. Tasks once assumed to be mine were now passed around carefully, almost experimentally. Each person discovered how much effort coordination actually required. The efficiency they missed wasn't my personality, it was my consistency. Consistency is invisible until it's gone. My sister adjusted again. She became more self-sufficient, but also more guarded. The warmth she once received without effort now required maintenance. Emotional capital, like any other resource, depreciates when overused. I didn't enjoy watching that process, but I didn't interrupt it either. At one point, she attempted to rewrite the past in softer language. Not denial, revision. She spoke about misunderstanding, about stress, about how everyone was overwhelmed. It was an invitation for mutual absolution without accountability, a chance to reset without reflection. I acknowledged the stress. I didn't accept the revision. That moment mattered. It was the first time I made it clear, without accusation, that I wasn't willing to carry ambiguity for others anymore. I didn't need blame assigned. I needed clarity preserved. The family felt it. Conversations became more careful. Not colder, more deliberate. People realized I wasn't interested in emotional shortcuts. That made interactions slower, but more honest. There's a common belief that forgiveness requires forgetting. It doesn't. Forgetting benefits the person who caused harm more than the person who absorbed it. I wasn't holding resentment. I was holding memory. Memory protects boundaries. I continued showing up on my terms. Brief visits. Clear timelines. Neutral engagement. I was neither distant nor intimate. I existed in a defined space that didn't invite projection. That balance reduced tension in ways arguments never could. Gradually, the family adapted to the new normal. They stopped expecting me to fill emotional gaps. They stopped speaking for me. They stopped assuming access. None of this was discussed openly. It didn't need to be. Behavior had already changed. The most telling sign came unexpectedly. Someone defended me in a conversation I wasn't part of. Not passionately. Not dramatically. Just matter-of-factly. They corrected a small assumption. The room moved on. No discomfort. No debate. That's how you know a narrative has lost power, when it no longer requires protection. I didn't feel relief. I felt confirmation. Quiet revenge isn't about reversal. It's about recalibration. About letting systems adjust to the weight they once avoided. By refusing to carry what wasn't mine, I had forced honesty into the structure. What remained was a family that functioned with clearer limits and fewer illusions. Not perfect. Not healed. But real. And real, I had learned, is the only foundation that doesn't collapse under silence. Betrayal sharpens when you realize the people who benefited most from your restraint now resent you for it. By the time the family settled into its new rhythm, something else had begun to surface. Quiet resistance. Not from everyone. From a few. The ones who had relied most heavily on my steadiness without acknowledging it. The ones who felt exposed now that they had to manage their own emotions. Resistance doesn't announce itself. It questions. It reframes. It tests limits under the guise of curiosity. I noticed it in the way my choices were suddenly examined. You've changed. You seem distant. Are you okay? Each question carried an implication. Return to who you were so we can feel comfortable again. I didn't take offense. I recognized the pattern. Change unsettles people who benefited from stability they didn't create. I answered simply. I'm fine. No elaboration. No reassurance. That unsettled them more than anger ever could have. The rising conflict wasn't loud. It was structural. Expectations clashed with reality. People wanted access without accountability. They wanted the benefits of my presence without respecting its boundaries. That tension grew slowly, like pressure in a sealed room. My sister felt it too. Her influence had narrowed. She was no longer the emotional center by default. That shift made her more assertive, not openly, but strategically. She began positioning herself as the interpreter of intention, explaining why people felt the way they did, translating silence into meaning. That role kept her relevant. I didn't challenge it publicly. I watched how often her interpretations replaced direct communication. How frequently people accepted her explanations instead of asking questions themselves. That told me the conflict wasn't resolved. It had simply matured. There came a moment when a decision directly affected me, and it was made without consulting me again. This time, though, it wasn't framed as oversight. It was framed as efficiency. We didn't want to bother you. Efficiency is often the language of exclusion dressed as courtesy. I didn't protest. I adjusted my plans accordingly, without apology or complaint. The adjustment created inconvenience elsewhere. Not intentionally. Just naturally. Systems feel the absence of coordination quickly. That inconvenience sparked frustration. Not toward the decision, but toward me. I had violated an unspoken rule: adapt quietly so others don't have to. My refusal to absorb the disruption exposed how dependent the system still was on my flexibility. That's when the conflict surfaced more clearly. Someone finally said it out loud. "We used to rely on you more." The sentence wasn't accusatory. It was nostalgic. Nostalgia is dangerous. It romanticizes imbalance. It remembers benefits without acknowledging cost. I nodded. I didn't argue. That response forced them to sit with the implication. Reliance had been real, unspoken, unequal, and now it was gone. The tension spread unevenly. Some adapted. Some withdrew. Some grew sharper in tone, mistaking firmness for coldness. I stayed consistent. Consistency removes ambiguity. Without ambiguity, manipulation has nowhere to hide. My sister attempted to reassert emotional authority once more, this time by aligning with concern. She suggested I was isolating myself, that my boundaries were signs of unresolved hurt. It was a familiar tactic: pathologize independence to reclaim influence. I didn't deny the hurt. I denied the interpretation. "I'm choosing differently," I said. That distinction mattered. Hurt seeks repair. Choice asserts control. People who rely on emotional leverage don't know how to negotiate with choice. After that, the conflict shifted from subtle to strained. Not openly hostile. Just uncomfortable. The room no longer smoothed itself around unspoken expectations. Friction lingered longer. Silence lasted a beat too long, and I let it. Rising conflict is where most people reveal themselves, not through action, but through discomfort. Who demands resolution? Who avoids accountability? Who adapts without complaint? I observed it all without inserting myself into the outcome, because by then, I understood something clearly. The conflict wasn't about me anymore. It was about a system adjusting to the loss of someone who had carried more than their share, and refusing to pick it up again. Injustice becomes obvious when people start blaming your boundaries for the discomfort caused by their expectations. As the tension thickened, I noticed a shift in language. My consistency was now being labeled as rigidity. My distance was being called withdrawal. Words were doing the work that confrontation couldn't. When people can't argue with your actions, they redefine them. I didn't correct the labels. Labels lose power when they aren't defended against. The family began navigating around me instead of with me. Plans were made cautiously. Information was shared selectively. Not to exclude me outright, but to control outcomes. Control often masquerades as coordination. I stayed neutral. I responded when addressed. I declined when necessary. I didn't explain my reasoning. Reasoning invites negotiation. Negotiation invites erosion. I wasn't interested in erosion anymore. My sister leaned harder into emotional framing. She spoke of balance, of unity, of how things used to be. She positioned herself as the voice of restoration, without acknowledging what needed to be restored, or why it had fractured. Restoration without accountability is just repetition. I listened. I didn't commit. There was a particular moment when she tried to position me as the obstacle to peace. Not directly. Indirectly. She suggested that unresolved tension lingered because I hadn't fully processed what happened. The implication was clear. My boundaries were symptoms, not decisions. I responded calmly. I've processed it. I've just decided how I want to move forward. That answer ended the conversation. Processing implies emotional work. Decision implies agency. You can't manage someone who has decided. The conflict escalated not through volume, but through avoidance. People began tiptoeing. Conversations were held in fragments. No one wanted to provoke anything. That fragility revealed how much emotional labor I had once absorbed without recognition. Without a stabilizer, the system overcorrected. Everyone became cautious. That caution slowed everything down. Decisions took longer. Plans changed more often. Frustration grew, but no one knew where to place it. That's when projection intensified. I became the silent reference point. He probably wouldn't like that. That might make things awkward. My presence was now felt even when I wasn't there. Not as authority, but as potential disruption. That's a strange position to occupy, being influential without participating. I didn't seek to dismantle that perception. I let it sit. Over time, the tension forced people to speak more directly to each other. They couldn't rely on emotional buffering anymore. Conflicts that had been smoothed over now surfaced plainly. Some were resolved. Some weren't. But all of them were real. My sister's role shifted again. Without the ability to redirect energy toward me, she had to face inconsistencies closer to herself. That didn't lead to confession or collapse. It led to defensiveness. Subtle. Controlled. Exhausting. I felt no satisfaction watching it. Only confirmation. Quiet revenge isn't about watching others struggle. It's about stepping out of a pattern so clearly that the pattern can no longer disguise itself. By the end of that phase, the family dynamic felt heavier but more honest. Fewer assumptions. Less emotional shorthand. More responsibility carried individually. That weight belonged where it always should have. And I remained where I had chosen to stand, calm, defined, and no longer available as a scapegoat for discomfort I didn't create. Danger reveals itself when the people who once spoke for you begin speaking against the silence you no longer break. By this stage, the conflict had matured into something sharper. Not explosive. Calculated. The family no longer questioned whether I had changed. They questioned what my change meant for them. That's when discomfort turns personal. I noticed how often my name came up in conversations as a variable instead of a person. If he comes, we'll have to be careful. If he hears about this, he might misinterpret it. The irony was almost quiet enough to miss. I wasn't reacting. I wasn't interfering. I wasn't asking for anything. Yet I was being treated as a risk. That's what happens when you stop being predictable. Predictability makes people feel safe. Boundaries make them feel exposed. My sister made one last attempt to regain footing by reframing the entire situation as a misunderstanding between strong personalities. It was a clever move. Neutral. Balanced. It removed intent from every action. No villains. No victims. Just complexity. Complexity is often used to erase responsibility. I didn't contradict her. I didn't support her either. That absence of alignment mattered. People looked between us, waiting for me to either confirm or deny the version being offered. I did neither. I allowed the silence to stretch just long enough to be noticed. Silence forces others to fill it with their own interpretations. Some did. Some didn't. But the moment passed without resolution, and that unresolved space stayed with them longer than any explanation could have. The conflict reached its quiet peak when I declined something that had once been expected without question. Not dramatically. Just calmly. I said it wouldn't work for me. No apology. No justification. The reaction wasn't anger. It was confusion. Confusion is powerful. It disrupts assumptions. It makes people reconsider what they thought was stable. I watched as that confusion traveled through the room, changing the energy without a word being spoken. Later, someone asked me privately if I was trying to make a point. I answered honestly, no. I'm just not compensating anymore. That sentence landed heavier than I intended. Not because it was harsh, but because it named something that had never been acknowledged. Compensation implies imbalance. Imbalance implies awareness. Awareness implies responsibility. They didn't argue. From that moment on, the conflict stopped escalating. Not because it was resolved, but because it had been recognized. Recognition changes behavior. People became more careful about what they asked and how they asked it. They adjusted without discussion. My sister withdrew slightly. Not dramatically. Just enough to preserve dignity. The emotional authority she once held had diminished, not through confrontation, but through exposure to reality without reinforcement. What surprised me most was how little satisfaction I felt. There was no sense of victory. No closure. Just a quiet understanding that the dynamic had shifted permanently. That's when I realized something important. The rising conflict wasn't meant to be won. It was meant to reveal. And it did. It revealed who relied on imbalance. Who adapted with maturity. Who needed control more than connection. And who respected boundaries once they realized they couldn't move them. By the end of it, I wasn't standing in opposition to anyone. I was standing outside a system that no longer needed me to function dishonestly. And that was enough. Shock came quietly, the kind that doesn't announce itself with anger or confrontation. It arrives when you realize patience can be sharper than any outburst. The turning point began the moment I understood I didn't need to argue to reclaim my position. I had spent months observing, withdrawing, and letting the system expose itself. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't demand explanations. I simply let consistency speak louder than accusation. It started with small moments of awareness. Someone miscommunicated a plan, expecting me to absorb the inconvenience. I didn't. I calmly clarified my availability without judgment or emotion. That simple act caused hesitation. People began to double-check their assumptions. My sister noticed it first. She adjusted her tone, her framing, her questions. It was subtle, but deliberate. The realization struck me clearly. Influence doesn't need confrontation. It only requires understanding how decisions ripple through the people around you. I could correct what had been distorted without lifting my voice. Without drama. Without showing that I had been wronged. I began to test it. I engaged selectively, offering clarity where it was essential but withholding emotional labor that had once been expected. Requests for my participation were met with polite, factual responses. Boundaries that had been challenged before were now acknowledged quietly, without resistance. People noticed. My sister adjusted again, trying once more to regain control, but this time her subtle cues were met with calm neutrality. She couldn't provoke me. She couldn't draw me into reactive patterns. Every attempt to manipulate, even softly, fell flat. And slowly, naturally, leverage shifted. Not with confrontation. Not with exposure. Just with a simple act of standing firm while letting the truth of my consistency unfold on its own. I realized the power I had carried unknowingly. My silence, my patience, my measured actions, they had been more influential than any argument I could have made. That evening, the first tangible change arrived. A minor issue, previously swept under the rug with my involvement, was addressed directly by others. They didn't consult me first. They didn't apologize. They just corrected it. That was the moment I understood. The system had begun to self-correct without my intervention. I had shifted from being a participant in manipulation to being an observer of natural justice. And that was the quiet brilliance of the turning point, the moment when patience became strategy, and strategy became inevitable consequence. From then on, every interaction carried weight, not because I asserted it, but because the consistency of my choices had already done the work. People adapted. They recalibrated. They realized they couldn't rely on me the same way again. This was the beginning of the subtle reclamation, not loud, not dramatic, but unmistakably effective. The stage was set, and the unseen shift was underway. I didn't need anyone to know I had planned it. The results spoke quietly, eloquently, and permanently. Danger had already begun to fade the moment I realized that influence isn't earned by force, it's earned by consistency. The turning point continued quietly, in ways that no one noticed at first. I began re-engaging selectively, offering input only where it mattered. Not to reclaim old control, not to prove a point, but simply to demonstrate clarity and competence. Every suggestion I made was precise, deliberate, and detached from emotion. That made people listen in a way they hadn't before. My sister noticed first. Her usual subtle cues, the gentle reminders, the reframed concerns, the soft emotional appeals, had no effect anymore. I didn't argue. I didn't apologize. I didn't explain. I simply responded with facts and boundaries. Facts can't be twisted without acknowledgement, and boundaries can't be ignored without confrontation. The ripple effect was immediate. Where once my input was assumed, it now had to be earned. People began consulting each other more directly, verifying facts, questioning assumptions instead of repeating them blindly. I didn't interfere. I let it unfold naturally. That's the beauty of patient strategy. It forces people to face consequences of their own making. One evening, a minor miscommunication occurred, something that would have previously been redirected through me. Instead, others corrected it themselves. Not perfectly, not immediately, but they tried. And in that attempt, I saw the first signs of balance returning. Not because anyone admitted fault, but because the system could no longer rely on me to absorb imbalance silently. My sister's attempts to regain authority became more cautious. She tested fewer boundaries. She framed concerns carefully, knowing I would not respond the way I used to. The subtle tension that had been used as leverage evaporated because the pattern no longer worked. I never spoke about fairness. I never demanded acknowledgement. I let the clarity of my actions speak for me. By showing up without overcompensating, I revealed the natural consequences of their previous reliance on my emotional labor. The most powerful part of this turning point was its invisibility. People adapted not because I forced them to, but because they realized, subtly, that the old dynamics no longer applied. Stability, patience, and measured choices had done more than confrontation ever could. By the end of this segment, I understood that quiet, deliberate actions had shifted the balance entirely. Influence returned, not as dominance, but as respect. People adjusted. Systems corrected themselves. And I stood calmly at the center, no longer defending, only observing the results of my careful patience. The turning point had arrived, not with drama or vengeance, but with the quiet power of letting truth, consistency, and discretion do the work. Shock arrived quietly the day I realized the momentum had shifted completely. Not because I had spoken louder, argued harder, or forced acknowledgement, but because patience had done what confrontation never could. By now, the family had begun adjusting naturally to the boundaries I had set months ago. Requests that had once assumed my compliance were now framed as invitations. Conversations that had once relied on my emotional labor now required direct communication between the participants themselves. The system had started correcting itself. My sister tested it one last time. She framed a concern, subtle and deliberate, the kind designed to draw me back into the old pattern of mediation. I answered calmly, with precision and detachment. No apologies, no defenses, no emotional overtones. Just facts. Just boundaries. The silence that followed was telling. The attempt to manipulate through expectation had failed. Others noticed too. They began double-checking assumptions, questioning miscommunications, and clarifying intentions without my involvement. The imbalance that had once depended on me to absorb it silently was gone. People were accountable, not because anyone demanded it, but because the structure no longer allowed for avoidance. I didn't celebrate. I didn't announce a victory. Quiet revenge doesn't need applause. Its power is revealed in subtle shifts, the small corrections, the careful recalibrations, the recognition that no one can rely on your compliance indefinitely. The real turning point came in an ordinary moment. A misstep occurred that would have previously fallen on me to fix. This time, it was corrected by those directly involved. No one consulted me. No one justified the correction. It simply happened. The weight of responsibility had shifted back to where it belonged. My sister adjusted, subtly but permanently. She had to face inconsistencies and logistical challenges herself, rather than channeling them toward me. The authority she had wielded through subtle emotional manipulation lost its leverage. That shift didn't require confrontation. It only required patience, observation, and steadfast consistency. I realized then that the true power of this moment was invisible. It wasn't about forcing recognition. It wasn't about proving who was right. It was about allowing reality to unfold under conditions I controlled silently, my presence, my restraint, my clarity. By the end of this phase, the family dynamic had shifted. Boundaries were respected. Responsibilities were recalculated. Expectations were recalibrated. I had reclaimed influence, not with noise, not with drama, but with patience, clarity, and the quiet authority of someone who no longer allowed manipulation to dictate their role. And that, I understood fully, was the essence of quiet, patient revenge. Letting the system correct itself while maintaining your own integrity, letting consequences arrive naturally, and allowing others to feel the weight of their own actions without uttering a single word. Justice often arrives quietly, not like a storm but like a tide that steadily reshapes the shore. By the time I reached this stage, I realized that the subtle shifts I had set in motion months ago were now producing results that didn't require confrontation, explanation, or even recognition. People began adjusting their behavior not because they were forced to, but because the consequences of previous choices had become unavoidable. The first clear sign came from my sister herself. She had once relied on my support as a buffer, using my presence to stabilize situations that she could not manage alone. She had spoken through me, interpreted events through me, and subtly positioned herself as someone whose perspective needed reinforcement. But now, she faced the very things she had once redirected toward me. I watched quietly as she learned, step by careful step, that emotional leverage has limits and that stability cannot be borrowed indefinitely. It started with small, ordinary inconveniences. A plan went slightly wrong. A message was misinterpreted. An expectation she had relied on me to fulfill was unmet. In the past, these incidents would have been smoothed over by my intervention. Not anymore. I had withdrawn my silent labor. I had decided that boundaries, once challenged, were no longer negotiable. And in that withdrawal, the first lessons began to form. She tried subtle manipulation at first. A question framed as concern. A comment shaped like curiosity but loaded with implication. She sought to gauge whether I would revert to old patterns, whether I would absorb the emotional weight as I always had. I remained neutral, calm, and precise. I answered factually, briefly, without embellishment or apology. My restraint forced her to confront the imbalance herself. This was the essence of what I had learned. You don't need to argue for justice. You simply need to stop being the instrument that allows imbalance to thrive. Once you remove yourself from a system that exploits your consistency, consequences arrive naturally. They are inevitable. The family noticed the shift slowly. Conversations that had previously flowed through me now required direct engagement. Decisions were made with more care. Missteps could no longer be redirected silently. Responsibility, once diffused, now rested where it always should have. It wasn't punishment. It wasn't revenge in the dramatic sense. It was natural justice, the kind that unfolds when accountability meets awareness. I observed without interference. That was critical. Any attempt to reclaim authority would have undermined the lesson. The more I remained neutral, precise, and unyielding in my boundaries, the more fully consequences played out. I was no longer participating in the old dynamic. I was letting it correct itself, quietly but effectively. Then came the moments that revealed the subtle power of perception. People began referencing incidents correctly for the first time. Facts were shared without distortion. Minor corrections were made to narratives that had once painted me inaccurately. These corrections didn't require confrontation. They didn't require explanation. They simply happened because the fabric of reality had shifted enough to make distortion impossible without contradiction. My sister struggled more than anyone else. She was forced to navigate situations without the buffer she had depended on. I could see the effort in her tone, in her phrasing, in the way she approached conversation cautiously, carefully weighing every word. That wasn't humiliation. That was realization, the natural consequence of relying on someone else to absorb tension, to mediate, to stabilize while remaining unseen. I didn't take joy in it. I simply noticed, observed, waited. That's the moral aspect of quiet revenge. It doesn't rely on satisfaction derived from suffering. It relies on the natural unfolding of consequence when you refuse to be exploited. The larger family dynamic adjusted gradually. Invitations were extended more intentionally. Decisions were discussed more openly. Accountability spread organically. Where once assumptions had dominated, now clarity was slowly restored. People began to see what they had relied upon for convenience, and that realization made them cautious, careful, thoughtful in ways they had never been before. At home, I maintained my boundaries. I offered help selectively, intentionally, and always with transparency. I no longer mediated disputes that didn't require my input. I no longer explained myself to satisfy emotional expectations. I spoke when necessary, acted when necessary, and remained neutral and calm at all other times. That posture created an environment where natural justice could function. There was one particularly telling incident. A logistical error occurred during a family gathering. In the past, I would have anticipated the problem and fixed it before anyone noticed. This time, I did nothing beyond clarifying my availability and limitations. Others scrambled, adjusted, and resolved the issue themselves. It wasn't seamless. There was friction, hesitation, and small mistakes. But the lesson was clear. The system could not function as it had when I carried the unspoken weight of others' assumptions. I observed my sister as she navigated that friction. She remained composed, but the effort was evident. She asked questions directly. She sought input only when necessary. She recalculated priorities without using me as a reference point. That shift alone signaled the success of the quiet strategy one had employed. The natural unfolding of responsibility had taught her what intervention could not, that reliance on someone else is never guaranteed, and that stability is earned, not assumed. The subtleties of these moments were remarkable. There was no dramatic confrontation, no raised voices, no accusations. Yet the shift was absolute. People began adjusting behavior unconsciously, in response to the consistency I had maintained and the boundaries I had enforced. Quiet revenge is often invisible, but its effects are unmistakable. It doesn't seek recognition, but it produces profound change. Over the next several weeks, patterns continued to emerge. Conversations became more intentional. Miscommunications were addressed directly rather than being smoothed over through intermediaries. Emotional appeals were tempered by practical considerations. And the lessons that had begun with small incidents were reinforced over time, creating a ripple effect that spread through the family. My sister's position transformed subtly. She no longer dominated through emotional authority. She had to confront challenges directly, without leveraging my presence as support. Her confidence remained, but it was now grounded in her own capability rather than in the system she had once manipulated. That shift didn't require confrontation. It required observation, patience, and strategic non-interference. The larger lesson became clear to me as well. Justice often arrives without fanfare. It doesn't require anger, confrontation, or spectacle. It arrives when patterns of exploitation are no longer reinforced, when responsibility is restored naturally, and when others are forced to confront the consequences of relying on someone else's consistency without acknowledgement. At home, life returned to a quieter balance. The family adapted to the new norms. Requests were framed carefully. Conversations were measured. Expectations became reasonable. The imbalance that had caused tension and frustration no longer existed, not because anyone admitted wrongdoing, but because the structure itself had corrected under the weight of natural consequence. I reflected on all of it quietly. I had achieved a resolution not through confrontation, not through drama, not even through deliberate intervention. I had achieved it through patience, clarity, and refusal to participate in patterns of manipulation. The system had corrected itself, and those who had relied on my silence or my labor had learned lessons that words could never convey. And through it all, I maintained my calm, my boundaries, and my principles. I had reclaimed agency not by asserting dominance, but by letting reality unfold according to its own logic. That, I realized, is the essence of true moral revenge. It doesn't seek retribution. It allows natural consequence to correct imbalance while preserving integrity, dignity, and restraint. By the end of this segment, I understood that the resolution was not about winning arguments or forcing acknowledgement. It was about establishing a new equilibrium, where responsibility, accountability, and clarity replaced manipulation, reliance, and unspoken expectation. I had reclaimed influence, not through confrontation, but through patience, observation, and quiet consistency. The family, now functioning with clearer boundaries and a more honest dynamic, had learned lessons that could not be ignored. My sister had adjusted. Others had adapted. The system no longer relied on me to absorb imbalance. Stability had returned, but on terms that respected reality rather than illusion. And in that stillness, I felt something I had not expected. Satisfaction not born from triumph over others, but from witnessing the natural unfolding of justice, consequence, and moral clarity. I knew then that the resolution was complete, not because anyone had said so, but because the patterns had shifted irrevocably. The tension had dissolved. Accountability had returned. The lessons had been learned. And the quiet authority I had maintained throughout had proven its value without a single word of confrontation. Shock lingers in subtle ways, the kind that doesn't announce itself with drama but with quiet recognition. People begin to notice that the balance they once relied on no longer exists. By now, the consequences of withdrawal and careful boundaries had begun to take shape in ways I hadn't even needed to plan further. The system had started to correct itself naturally, and the lessons were spreading silently, with impact far beyond any single interaction. The first tangible sign came from the family conversations that no longer relied on me as an intermediary. In the past, I had absorbed tension, rephrased concerns, and smoothed over miscommunications. That labor had been invisible, expected, and ultimately unappreciated. When I stopped performing it, the dynamics shifted immediately. Others now faced responsibility directly. They were forced to engage honestly rather than rely on my presence to carry the emotional weight. My sister, who had once positioned herself as the central figure in every discussion, began to adjust cautiously. Her subtle attempts to elicit my old patterns of engagement, questions wrapped in concern, suggestions framed as guidance, met a calm neutrality instead of reaction. I did not resist her. I simply responded with clarity and restraint, refusing to perform the role she had come to expect. That simple refusal reshaped her approach. She became deliberate. She recalculated priorities. She confronted inconsistencies herself rather than channeling them through me.